All right, these are the notes for natural selection and evolution. To start off with, when we hear the term evolution, the individual we most often hear associated with this is Charles Darwin. And his theory had three parts. The first part was that a species can change over time, that they are not static. The second piece is that any changes to the normal forms are due to environmental conditions. It's not random, but rather that a species, if it is changing, is going to change in response to an environmental condition. Our last piece of Darwin's evolutionary theory is that species will develop new traits only if it makes them more successful within that environment. Now, the natural selection is the process by which this idea of evolution takes place, and natural selection is often referred to as the survival of the fittest. Now, it's basically the idea here is not the individuals that are the strongest physically, but the ones that are the fittest. Organisms that have the most adaptive traits, the ones that are able to do the most, that are able to survive the best, and have the most offspring. Because if they're doing really successfully, if they have lots of these extra resources, they're able to support more offspring. Their offspring are going to have more resources and are going to then be able to produce more grandbaby offspring. And as long as those traits can be passed down, what will happen is the majority of the population over time will end up having the trait, because the ones that are surviving are the ones that have the trait. Now, we do not get traits because there's a need. It has to work with what's already there. Now, in any living population, we have a lot of variation. If we just look at humans and height or weight or eye color, we have variations. Most of our variations don't influence our success or lack of success. However, if we have an environmental change, then sometimes we have certain traits that have a much stronger influence. So, for example, in humans, prior to having the opportunity to have glasses or contacts, if you had very, very poor eyesight and it was hereditary, then your opportunities for being successful at hunting or gathering were less, and so consequently what we saw was poor eyesight was selected against. Now, once we had the development of glasses and contacts, now what we see is we actually see a higher prevalence of individuals with poor eyesight, because it no longer actually affects our survival, because we have methods of correcting this. Now, when we go through, for evolution to happen, it has three things that need to be there. So first thing that has to be there is we have to have an overproduction of offspring. There have to be more babies born than will survive in each generation. The next big thing that we need is we need to have some variation. And this can be due to mutations. We can have positive variation. For example, some individuals may be more resistant to certain infections. It could be things that are negative, like having lactose intolerance or having severe allergies. Or it can be completely neutral, like in humans having eye color. Now, if we have no variation, then there's nothing for evolution to work on. We're not going to see any changes. However, as soon as we have some variation, and we have more individuals there than will survive, then if we get competition and not all organisms get equal resources, then the ones that are the worst fit end up dying off. And the ones that are the best fit get more of those resources and are able to have more offspring. So the worst adapted organisms eventually die, or they fail to have babies. So even if you have a maladaptive trait that is not hurting you so bad that it causes you to die, but if it stops you from being able to have any babies, then your genetics don't get passed down. And if the genetics don't get passed down in the next generation, we don't see those traits in our gene pool. Their genetics just disappear in the next generation, and it causes the population as a whole to become better adapted. Now, there are three types of natural selection. So the first type of natural selection is directional. So in directional, if we have organisms, and let's say the climate, for example, after the Ice Age, the climate started getting warmer. When we went from woolly mammoths to elephants, this was a directional selection. The woolly mammoths that had less fur did better than the ones who had more fur because the weather wasn't cold anymore and all of that fur is heavy and it caused them to overheat. So over time, if we look here, we have some of the original population die off. Well, as that original population dies off, our curve remains. However, the arc of the curve changes because those who had less fur did a little bit better. And so what we start seeing is elephants that don't have fur. Now, stabilizing selection is one where any organisms that are on either end, so if they're either too big or too small, they die off. And this is where we have evolution, where the population becomes more and more alike. Human birth weight is actually a stabilizing. If babies are too small, a lot of times they don't survive. And if babies are too big, a lot of times what happens is either the mother has to have a C-section, or both mom and baby pre-C-sections would die because the baby wouldn't be able to be born. And so consequently what we see is most human babies fall within the range of usually between 6 to 9 pounds. Now we do have some smaller babies that do all right, and we have some bigger babies that do all right, but we're not seeing 2-pound babies, and we're not seeing 20-pound infants. And so we did have some stabilization there. The last type is disruptive. So organisms that are in a new environment, and let's say, for example, if I look at the cats, and we had populations of cats, if I look at, for example, even lions and tigers, where some of them ended up going and living in one type of area, for example, the tigers in the forests, and lions stayed on the savannas. So the lions didn't develop stripes because they wouldn't help them out in the grasslands, whereas the tigers did develop stripes because it helps them camouflage when you are in the jungle. If any organisms in the center die off, what you start seeing is the populations start becoming more and more different. And if it continues long enough, this is when we start seeing the populations no longer interbreeding, no longer having babies with each other. Sometimes that can be because they just don't find each other attractive, or because they've actually physically moved so far away from each other that they're not interacting like lions and tigers. If any organisms in the center usually die out, we actually end up seeing something called speciesization. This is where we start seeing two species that had originated from one species. So this is the kind of three main types of our natural selection. Now remember, when we go back up and we talk about the idea of evolution, evolution is simply having a change in the gene pool. So if the DNA that exists in a population, if the frequency that we see specific genes changes, evolution has happened. So that was natural selection and evolution.